Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining for our second MACFEST 2021 event of the day. We just had a super exciting opening ceremony which laid out just the richness and the diversity of all the events we have going on, up to 70 events, most of which are free. And yeah, it's a real pleasure. I've been working for MACFEST for 2 years now, and it's just been an incredible step for me into Muslim culture, and I'm just really honored to be a part of it. And really honored to be asked to introduce the moderator for this talk, which is Medicine in the Middle East, a forgotten heritage shared between East and West. This event will be moderated by Dr. Savas Konur, who is from the Foundation for Science, Technology and Civilization. Dr. Savas Konur is a reader at the University of Bradford. He received his PhD from the University of Manchester before joining Bradford. He held positions in the University of Liverpool and the University of Sheffield. Dr. Konur is the managing editor of Muslim Heritage webpage, which is one of the most popular web portals in history of science. So thank you so much. Enjoy this event, and over to you, Dr. Savas.
Thank you so much, Gisela. I am so pleased and honored to moderate such a wonderful talk given by a distinguished guest, Professor Peter Pormann, who is very well known in this area, and his scholarly work is globally known. My encounter with Professor Portman was through Foundation of Science, Civilization and Technology. So I got involved with the foundation from the very beginning of my PhD studies at the University of Manchester. The Foundation of Civilization Technology, I'm just sharing my screen to show you the website, which was founded by Emeritus Professor Salim El-Hassani. So mainly to popularize the cultural roots of the early inventions and discoveries which still have effect on our modern world. And also it aimed to highlight the shared cultural and technological inheritance of humanity. One of the biggest projects of Foundation is Muslim Heritage website, which is dedicated to the researching and popularizing the history of the pre-Renaissance civilizations, especially the Muslim civilization, but not limited to that geography, also including countries and civilizations like India, China, or other parts of the world. And also it investigates its impact on the scientific, technological, and the cultural heritage of our modern world. We have another project as Foundation, which is 1001 Cures. We already published a book which is edited by Professor Portman. He also edited a number of articles on this page. So after giving just brief introduction, I like to introduce our distinguished guest. Professor Portman is a professor of Classics and Graeco-Arabic studies. After studying classics, French and Islamic studies in Paris, which is Sorbonne University, and Hamburg and Tübingen in Germany, he took an MA in Islamic studies at the University of Leiden, and MA and Phil, Doctor of Philosophy and Doctor of Letters from the University of Oxford. He worked in the area of Greco-Arabic studies mainly. His research investigates the many contacts between the Muslims, Jews, Christians, writing in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic, be it in the 10th or 20th century, be it in medicine, philosophy, or literature, both drama and poetry. In his talk, Professor Pormann will take you a journey in the medicine in the Islamic world. I just want to now hand over to him, and please, Professor Portman, it is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Konur, for such a kind introduction. Thanks to everybody for making MACFEST happen, and I'm very, very pleased to be here. I don't know what I have to do to bring back the screen now. My presentation.
Professor, you might just need to restart the screen share.
Okay,
if that's possible.
so
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So so today we're going to talk about this shared heritage of medicine as it developed in the medieval Middle East. That's the topic, and I just want to remind you of the geography and some of the political developments that underpin or that form the background, so to speak, to this story. As you know, Islam arose in the Arabian Peninsula, and the first dynasty, that of the Umayyad, made its capital Damascus, a city that is very much part of the Hellenized world, where Greek was very much a language that some of the elite spoke and wrote to. The Abbasid in 750 then moved their capital further east to Baghdad, but their outlook, so to speak, is much more cosmopolitan, although they themselves are from good Arabic stock, so to speak. They had very strong ties in the East, clients in the East that helped them, gain power, and their outlook, so to speak, is very cosmopolitan. And in part, this cosmopolitan outlook, this outlook that looks beyond the purely Arabic culture, made it possible to create a legacy that is absolutely fantastic, not just in the area of medicine, but also philosophy, science, literature, theology, you name it. And this can nicely be illustrated through an image we see here, Aristotle and
Mr. Portman, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're not currently seeing that screen. Would you mind just restarting the screen share using the bottom controls?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Thank you kindly.
Because I can see the screen.
No worries, just within Zoom as you did in the
yes,
rehearsal. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. Share screen.
Unless, Luke, you've got it, if you want to share it for him.
Hang on
It's
a
right,
second.
there it
Just
goes.
give me 1 second and then share screen. How does, any luck?
Yes, we can see that now, yes.
So let's try again.
Thank you so much.
So basically, I was just talking about the movement from Damascus to Baghdad. And this image here illustrates, I think, very nicely this shared heritage. We see Aristotle and Alexander the Great in correspondence. And as you know, Alexander the Great, I mean, the founder of many Alexandrias, the one in Egypt is the most famous, conquered much of the known world, especially the lands that would later become the lands of Islam, and Hellenized that period. And he, as a ruler, was also very interested in knowledge. There's the famous Library of Alexandria. And there is a story that is told in the Arabic literature that basically Alexander the Great had all the texts from, let's say, Mesopotamia, from what would later become Iraq and other parts of the what would later become the Muslim world, translated from those languages, let's say Akkadian, Sumerian, and so on and so forth, into ancient Persian, into Greek, and that basically the store of the Greek knowledge that we find in Alexandria is basically the knowledge of these Eastern civilizations, the ancestors, so to speak, to what would become the world of Islam. Now, it is a story and a myth, but it has a little kernel of truth in the sense that the contribution to how medicine developed in the Greek world takes a lot from both Egypt and the ancient Near Eastern culture, and so there's a kernel of this regaining of one's own knowledge through translation, the topic that I'm going to discuss now. So what happened? So how did this medicine develop against this background that I've just described of a greater cosmopolitan outlook? So throughout the 8th and especially the 9th century, virtually all the available Greek medical literature as it existed was translated from Greek into Syriac and Aramaic dialect, and then Arabic, the language obviously of Islam and the Arab conquerors, and a lot of this translation activity, as far as medicine is concerned, centered around the team of translators assembled by Hunayn ibn Ishaq. So he is a Syriac-speaking Christian, but he also learns, so he speaks this Aramaic dialect, the language that the Jews would have spoken natively, but he grew up also learning Arabic and was very fluent and competent in Arabic. And he and his team, so his son Ishaq ibn Hunayn, his nephew Hubaish, and others translated the vast majority of medical literature from Greek into Syriac and from Syriac into Arabic, and made this this body of knowledge, so to speak, available. Sometimes you feel stories about a house of wisdom, but there was no translation academy called House of Wisdom. That's just like a misunderstanding. And what is important to know about this translation activity is that it was very much sponsored by the Abbasid elite. So high-ranking officials at the courts of the caliphs paid very, very good money to have these texts translated. So although the translators themselves are often Christian, like Hunayn and Ishaq and Hubaish and others, the paymasters, so to speak, the people who make them translate these things, are very much part of that Muslim elite. So it's like really a joint effort. So you could say that medicine, as it developed in the 8th and 9th century in the lands of Islam, is based very much on the translation of Greek texts. But it doesn't stop there. So sometimes people will say, "Oh, all the Arabs have ever done is like transmit and dilute or coarsen medical discourse through translation, and they were some sort of torch bearer that handed the torch later on to the Latin West." But that is a very wrong idea of the rich heritage in medicine that we see once again in the medieval Islamic world. So there's tradition, there's obviously a foundation of knowledge which is arrived at through translation, but there are also acts of innovation. But before I come to that, I just want to show you 2 images, which hopefully you can see now, which illustrate the cosmopolitan nature of Arabic, the fact that Arabic becomes the language of science and medicine and philosophy, not just for Muslims, but for Christian, Jews, Zoroastrians, you name it. So the first image that I'm showing you here is the beginning of a bilingual manuscript which contains the Hippocratic aphorisms. So this is life is short, the art is long, opportunity fleeting. You see this on the left side of the screen in Arabic, and on the right hand of the screen in Syriac. So this is a text that was translated into Syriac and Arabic, and the translators once again were these Syriac-speaking Christians. So Christian used this, but you also find Arabic as a language used by Jews, and this is a wonderful manuscript now in the Bibliothèque Nationale, which comes from Spain, 14th century. And if you look at the letters, you will see that these are not Arabic letters, they are Hebrew letters. And the title, the wonderful title in that square there in the center of the screen says Talkhis Kitab Hilat al-Bur, so an abridgment of the book of the method of healing. You see, this is not Hebrew, this is Arabic, and the text on the left-hand side begins with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Aunuka ya Rab. So in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, help us, O Lord. Although this is a text written by a Jew, I mean, it's not, this manuscript is not written by a Jew, by this Jew, Maimonides. So the text, the author of this text is Maimonides, who dies, Musa ibn Maimun, who dies in 1204. He wrote this abridgment of Galen's book of the method of healing, and we'll come back to Galen in a moment. But he does write it in Arabic, and it's written here in what we call Judeo-Arabic. So once again, not just Christians used Arabic as their language of science and medicine, but also Jews and many others. And this is beautifully illustrated here with the basmala in Hebrew letters, because obviously no Jew would have a problem to say, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, although nowadays this would not happen for political reason. So what is then this shared heritage that was expressed in this shared language? So it is basically what we call humoral pathology, the idea that the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, when in balance, constitute or lead to health, and their imbalance results in disease. And each of these four humors has two of the four cardinal qualities: moist and dry, and hot and cold. You can see this here, for instance, black bile is dry and cold. And in later times, to each bile, there's a temperament attached to it, so kind of a general constitution: melancholic, choleric, sanguine, and phlegmatic. And also certain parts of the zodiac, the ages of men, and the seasons. So this goes on a bit. This system is beautiful in its simplicity and logic, and it is a system which goes back once again to the Greeks. It's the principal idea of the four humors is first expressed in a book in the Hippocratic Corpus, attributed to Hippocrates, the doctor who lived in the 5th century BC, called On the Nature of Man, and then commented on by Galen of Pergamum, and who lived from 129 to 216 roughly AD, writes a big commentary on the nature of man, and is then further developed. But this general idea of the four humors is very pervasive. It dominates medicine in late antiquity, in Alexandria, for instance, and the Greek-speaking world. And it comes to dominate medicine in the West, in the Arabic-speaking world, and it stays with us till the 19th century. And as you will see towards the end of my talk, it still sometimes is with us today. So this is basically the underlying theory that is inherited from the Greeks and then further developed. Now, I promised you instances of innovation, and I'm going to give you a couple. I think I have 6 here, to show you that it's not just the transmission of knowledge, but it's also innovation. And one important area of medicine, of course, are drugs, drug making, how to select simple drugs, individual substances, and how to make these simple substances into compound drugs, so recipes for the composition of drugs. And on simple drugs, the most important Greek text is by Dioscorides, about whom we know very little. He might have been an army surgeon, army physician in the 1st century AD. And he wrote a work in 5 books on medicinal substances, Perihyles Iatrikes, on medical substances, and in Greek. And this is a very influential text. And here, for instance, you see a beautiful manuscript in Vienna now, which illustrates one entry on horsetail, hip uris, nicely illustrated, although the illustrations are not always very good matches to the actual plants. And you see this is a Greek manuscript, but even in this Greek manuscript, you will see that there are illustrate or annotations in Arabic, as you see on the top left, and on the bottom left, if you can see next to the roots there, there's even something in Hebrew. I've blown this up a bit to make this more visible. So I hope you can see this. So you have Iporis, it's transliterated, Dhamb al-Khayl, like the horse tail in Arabic, it's a loan translation, and then it's transliterated into Hebrew. So this is just to show you that this text basically in Greek was translated into Arabic more than once, was translated and annotated and excerpted many, many times, and even the Greek manuscripts that we have nowadays try to match this to the Arabic terms. So I just need to minimize this. I don't know how I do this. Oh no. Okay, maybe not. Oh. So I'm just. Okay, I just have like some of the screen obscured with my face. I don't know whether you see this, but in any case, so I said I would show you. So this is basically the Greek heritage, Dioscorides. Galen also wrote on simple drugs, and that was translated into Arabic, but we find new things. And I give you one instance here. We see a manuscript in Leiden now, which contains the 7th book of Ibn Sarabiyun's work, the handbook, let's say, on medicine, and it's basically the 7th book contains lists of compound drugs, how to make basically pills and pessaries and drafts and you name it. And here I give you one example of a compound drug that is new, that goes beyond the heritage of the Greek. It's Habhendi Yomal Misk, so an Indian pill which is made with musk. Yanfaubi something, I can't read it, by Yathabi Khafar al-Fam وكرارته التي تكون من الحفر, I think, ويشد الغمور وينقي الدمار ويشهي الجماع ويحيج شهوته. So basically this is an Indian pill that is good for the stomach. It takes away the stench of the mouth and the bad smell of the mouth, which is caused by tooth decay, and it firms up the gums, and it cleanses the brain, and it inspires or it makes one long for sexual intercourse and excites one's desire for it. So you see, this is a bit of a compound drug, so to speak, with more than one use. I mean, one can see why one sexual partner not having suffering from halitosis might increase one's desire for sex. But I mean, it basically helps your brain, it helps your breath, it helps your stomach, it helps your gums, it helps and it helps with sexual intercourse, so sexual desire. So why do I give you this Indian pill? Because you see, there's new medicinal substances come in from the East, and these medicinal substances like musk, the first one mentioned here in black is Ormal Kumar. It's the wood found from Cambodia. These new substances come in from the East, and they're incorporated into the materia medica, into the medicinal law of the Greeks, and obviously we find many new recipes, many new drugs that add these new substances, and that obviously greatly enhance the therapeutical potential at the time. Now, you also find innovation on the level of anatomical illustrations. Here, this is a manuscript in Cairo, which shows you how the eye works, the muscles of the eye. We don't have Greek medical illustrations of this type. They might have existed and they have all been lost, or this is the first instance where we have these detailed anatomical illustrations. And obviously, this is an instance of novelty. And ophthalmology in general is an area in which many Arab doctors excelled, and which is a separate branch in which they made great progress. Now, there is also the organization of knowledge. So one of the most important and most influential texts in medicine written in Arabic is the Canon of Medicine, Al-Qanun fi Tibb, by Avicenna, or Ibn Sina. Avicenna is the Latinized form, who lived from 980 till 1037. And this text is organized, it's an encyclopedia, which is organized in 5 parts. The first book is on generalities, kuliyat in Arabic. Books 2 is on simple drugs, book 5 is on compound drugs, and books 3 and 4 are on diseases from tip to toe, from head to bottom, and on diseases that are not located at a specific part of the body. And it's divided and subdivided and subdivided. And so it is an incredibly great exercise in organizing knowledge, in simplifying knowledge, in making knowledge accessible. I mean, it follows obviously on from a encyclopedic tradition that starts in Greek, but it goes far beyond what we have in our Greek sources. And some people have said that this encyclopedia and the many commentaries written on it might be stultifying or scholastic or not innovative, but nothing could be further from the truth. So because we have, when we look at this exegetical tradition, which has not been studied all that much, we find that there's quite a lot of interesting stuff in it. So the commentaries on the canon are interesting. I mean, people have looked at commentaries on Greek philosophical works and found that there's also interesting stuff in it. And they've looked at commentaries of the canon. I mean, Nahyan Fancy is the man who has probably worked most on one of them, Ibn Anafis. And I myself and my team, we've worked on commentaries on the Hippocratic aphorisms and other things. What we found is that in these commentaries you find very interesting debates. But there are many commentaries and commentaries of commentaries and super commentaries, and I'm just going to show you one, and this is Ibn Nafis's commentary on the canon. It's incredibly long. It's a massive endeavor, which of which I know only one complete manuscript in the Wellcome Library. But it's very interesting, and it has long been known that in this commentary on the canon, notably in the part on the anatomy, Ibn Nafis comes up with new ideas. And I give you just one instance of this, and this is what we call the pulmonary transit. So the idea is, if you look at the left-hand side, it was Galen's idea that blood passed from the right to the left ventricle of the heart through some sort of hole, manfadh in Arabic. And that is true in embryos, but it's not true once we start breathing, because obviously our blood passes through the lungs, where we now know that it's oxygenated and so on and so forth. Obviously, this was not known to Ibn Nafis, But Ibn Hanafi said, after reasoning about this and looking at Galen's idea of this, whole, this pore, said, La yujad hada manfad. This hole, this pore does not exist. And he says that the blood passes through the lungs from the right to the left ventricle of the heart, and then is expanded. I mean, he does not yet know about blood circulation, but he makes anatomical progress. And some have seen that this step in anatomical progress might have contributed to ideas about blood circulation as they were developed by William Harvey later, although once again, the idea of circulation of blood is not yet here. But it is a clear instance of progress, anatomical progress, finding this pulmonary transit. And that occurs once again in a commentary by Ibn Hanafi, a 13th century theologian and medical writer, writing on this commentary on Avicenna's canon. Now, there are other instances of innovation. Here, we're looking at Az-Zahrawi, Kitab al-Tasnif liman ajiza an al-Ta'lif, so the book written for people who can't compose it themselves or something like that. It's a rhyming title, and this is the last, the 30th part of this massive medical encyclopedia, by far the longest part. The 30th part is on surgery. It is in itself subdivided into 3 parts. We don't need to go into all the details, but basically, Az-Zahrawi in this part on surgery has many new instruments, many new procedures, and so for instance, he invents a hidden knife to take the fear of the patient away. Like he has an idea how to cut the trachea, and well, there's a new forceps for extracting dead fetuses. So we find instances of new instruments and new surgical techniques in this work by this author who lives around the year 1000 and hails from Muslim Spain. Finally, we come to the Islamic hospital. And that is a very, very interesting example, because it's a complex argument that one has to make here. So in my mind, there's no doubt that Islamic hospitals were highly innovative, but people have made exaggerated claims about how modern they are, that they are like modern hospitals and so on and so forth. So I think that there are 5 things that come together in the hospitals, let's say in 10th century Baghdad, for which we have good sources, that together make them something which looks very, very different from the institutions that existed, let's say in Byzantium before, or in the Christian world in general before. And I tell you what these 5 things are. The first thing is that they have security in law. They are awqaf, they are waqfs, they are foundations in Islamic law. These foundations are secure, they are endowed, they can't be touched by the taxman. It was a way kind of for you to avoid the equivalent of HMRC at the time. And there were obviously also instances of charity, zakat, and that meant that some of these institutions, some of these hospitals endured for centuries, one even a millennium, as charitable foundations, and that made them financially secure. The second is that although there are foundations in Islamic law, the medicine practiced there largely is the human pathology that I have described to you. This idea of the 4 humors, the compound drugs, the surgery that I've described, briefly. So this discourse, the medical discourse, the medicine that was on offer there transcended country and creed. And so did the patients. So we know of one Baghdad hospital that had not just doctors who were Muslim, Jews, Christian, and so on and so forth, but also patients. So neither was the medicine religious, so you don't go to a hospital to pray to get better. You go to the hospital for the, let's say, the medical knowledge of the time to be applied. And it was not through ritual, but through science, so to speak, that you would receive treatment there. And then, so the medicine there is secular, I mean, in inverted commas, as in according to the parameters that I've just explained. The third thing is that elite medicine comes to the hospital. So the best doctors work in hospitals. The doctors who treat the rulers also work in hospitals. So one very, very prominent example for this is Ar-Razi, Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria Ar-Razi, who basically dies in 925 and who is the most innovative clinician, and we will come back to him a little bit later, Ar-Razi. So he writes numerous works, very interesting works, is very, very innovative. And he works in a number of hospitals in his native Rai near Tehran, or what is it, nowadays Tehran, the wider Tehran, and also in Baghdad. So elite medicine moves into the hospital, and in these hospitals, he and others do medical research in the sense that they try out new drugs, they check, previous knowledge and look at whether they can match it, or confirm it or advance, and also they teach there. So we know of pupils following Ar-Razi and others to get medical instruction in hospitals. Now, these 5 things, so security and law, elite medicine moving into the hospital, secular medicine being practiced there, medical research and teaching, these 5 things taken together really make the hospitals of the Islamic world, as we know them, let's say in 10th century Baghdad, very different institutions from those of Byzantium before. And so for me, this is a clear instance of innovation, although we must not forget that obviously what I'm saying here sounds incredibly modern. These hospitals were obviously not like modern hospitals, and they do not have the same medicine as modern medicine practice there, and so on and so forth. So they were smaller, but still instances of innovation. And you can see here a plan of one hospital which is still standing in Cairo, the Qalawun Hospital. I mean, it's now a museum, but it functions until the 19th century, and it's fairly large and quite impressive. So we have these 6 examples of innovation. So the medicine of the time drew on Greek sources, but also innovated in numerous ways. And these are just vignettes. I could give you many more examples of innovation if I wanted to and had more time. But we shouldn't forget also that there are other aspects of medicine that happen and that are important. So one is the divine or magical aspects. So what I'd like to call popular medicine. So here you see one of these medicinal bowls. You pour water and you drink from it, and you get better. Sometimes they're illustrated with verses from the Quran, sometimes with magical texts. There's also magic that exists to heal you. Here you see a page from the Albuni's Shams al-Ma'arif al-Kubra, like the great son of knowledge, which is a magical text, and basically it shows you how to make an amulet. So you would write something on a piece of paper and then fold it and maybe word on your arm or in a locket or something like that. So these things did exist, and there were theoretical manuals on how to write these amulets. And then obviously we also have what is nowadays a famous part of Islamic medicine, namely the medicine of the Prophet, the Tib al-Nabi or Tib al-Nabawi. And so this begins basically with hadith collections. Like there's in the canonical hadith collections by Bukhari and Muslim, we find chapters entitled Ma anzalallahu da'an illa wa anzalallahu dawa'an. God did not send down a disease, da, without also sending down a cure, dawa. And then dawa sometimes is a shifa, I mean, it's sometimes changed. But so there are hadith, utterances of the Prophet in which are medically relevant, which were already collected in these canonical collections, and they are then used for a tradition which starts in the 10th century in the Shiite milieu, but really gets off the ground in the 13th century and develops massively there of manuals of prophetic medicine. And what is important to say here is these are not in conflict with the Greek humoral pathology. They often incorporate Greek humoral pathology and pepper them with hadiths of the Prophet, or like link them to utterances of the Prophet. So it's by no means a conflict between Greek or rational medicine and theology or anything like that. Forget this idea. It's just that they are then mixed. At the time, I mean, in the medical literature, you don't see much of that at all. The continuing medical literature in Arabic in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. But nowadays, they are real bestsellers. So nowadays, if you look from today and the importance today for some people, they have a greater importance than they had at the time. But it's important to mention this aspect of medicine. And I'm going to conclude now with a short outlook westwards and eastwards, what's happened after the Middle Ages. I told you I would return to Ar-Razi. You see him here in this Latin manuscript. I mean, obviously, probably not a good likeness. Latin manuscript of the 9th book for Al-Mansur, which is part of the medical encyclopedia that Ar-Razi wrote. And it's translated into Latin, and that becomes one of the most popular texts in the Latin Middle Ages. Even Vesalius, Andreas Vesalius, the great Flemish anatomical scholar and Renaissance doctor, his first book is a paraphrase, or let's say an abridgment of this 9th book, which he writes at the age of 28. So even for him, for one of these Renaissance physicians, which is seen as a break with the Middle Ages, Ar-Razi remains important. And of course, we've seen Avicenna's canon, and this canon is read in the West. It's translated into Latin by Gerard of Cremona, who dies in 1187, and becomes the core text for medical students. But here, I just thought I'd show you how someone at the Royal College of Physicians, or linked to the Royal College of Physicians in London, annotated this text and read it. So like this is the beginning of the text, and you can see how the definition of medicine, medicine is a science which recognizes the states of the human body and so on and so forth. This definition is translated in the margins here into Latin, and a Westerly Hand even gives a definition of health in Arabic. So like this text is studied by Westerners, so to speak, in Arabic, but it's also in Latin translation absolutely fundamental for university teaching. Now, Ar-Razi's influence continues in the 18th century. John Channing, an apothecary, president of the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries in London at one time, produces a bilingual Arabic-Latin edition of Ar-Razi's treatise on smallpox and measles. So this is an exercise in differential diagnosis, again, an instance of innovation. And a prominent French physician then translates his Latin translation into French, and justifies it by saying, I do not think it possible to bring the art of healing smallpox, especially in its initial state, to the same level of perfection as that achieved by Ar-Razi. So again, this legacy continues to be relevant to people in the West in the 18th century. And this is also taken to the East. So there's something called tip or Unani tip in India. It is a further development of the medical tradition that we find in Arabic and is exemplified through Avicenna's canon. And this is an illustration from the 19th century, but this continues today in India, Pakistan, and elsewhere. There are even colleges in this country here teaching this medical tradition, this Unani tip tradition, and it's big business and big pharma on the subcontinent, but you can also find people who take inspiration from Avicenna today. This is an image of a drug seller, I mean like drug as in medicinal substances seller. It says here, Huna Mahal al-Tib, here's the shop for medicine, At-Tib al-Arabi, so Arabic medicine, min Kitab Ibn Sina, from the book of Ibn Sina, Tib Tabi'i, you know, like in natural medicine, the whole range. And then it gives the name of the fellow. So if you go to any Arab country today, you will often find people who still practice that medical tradition, this tradition that is canonicized, that is basically expressed in Avicenna's canon of medicine. And so in this sense too, this tradition is with us today. So to conclude, I mean, we can see that the medical tradition as it developed in the worlds of, in the Islamic world, really draws on Greek heritage, but develops its own things, makes progress, furthers knowledge, and some of this stuff goes back to the West. It's basically the medical tradition as expressed in Avicenna's canon and other works are the foundation stones of university medicine in Western Europe, but also how medicine was practiced, not just in the Arab world, but in Persia and India and further beyond in the East. And therefore, it's a shared heritage in which many different people from many different countries and creeds of many different languages partake, and they could do so because it was expressed in Arabic in that shared language, and this human pathology, this inherited from the Greek, went once again beyond country and creed. Thank you very much indeed.
I would like to thank you very much, Professor Pormann, for this inspiring talk and a wonderful insight into the medical heritage in especially Islamic world. It was really fascinating to see how science facilitated the contacts between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, resulting in a shared heritage that I think we should all be proud of. Now, we have 12 minutes and we have a number of questions from our panelists. So the first question, explain the relationship between the Muslim medicine, nature, and traditional Chinese medicine's 5 elements.
Okay, it's a very difficult question.
Yeah.
So there was a historian of medicine, Henry Sigerist, Swiss originally, but spent most of his career in the United States, who had this idea that there are structural parallels. So four humors, 5 elements or whatever you want to call them, 5 forces. To the best of my knowledge, people have not been able to establish a generic link in the sense that, let's say, the 4 humors led to the 5 elements or 5 Chinese principles or whatever you want to call them, and vice versa. This said, there are scholars, Ronit Yueli Talim is the most prominent of them, who have tried to look at context between China and the Muslim world and influences sometimes via Tibet. And there's so there are certain exchanges that happen. Let's say in the 13th century, Rashiduddin is one Persian author who takes things from China, who's translated into Chinese. So later on, there are direct contacts, and these two traditions kind of meet. But I think they developed in parallel and independently from each other to the best of what we know today.
There is another interesting question. Is there evidence of correspondence links between the Arab hospitals and those of the Christian monasteries in Europe?
The short answer is yes. So it's a big question, but we have some people who say, you know, like, oh, we saw this in the East and we exported this. There's also hospitals, for instance, in Muslim Spain. So the Crusades are not the only point of contact, maybe not even the most important point of contact between, let's say, the Arabs or Muslims and Christians. So they also happen, let's not forget, in Muslim Spain and Italy and other parts. Yes, there undoubtedly was some inspiration in what people have seen in, let's say, the lens of Islam, and what they then do when they go home, or well, as they were, let's say, still on crusade. I think that's pretty much beyond dispute. But you know, like, I want to just say one word of warning. Sometimes people think, you know, like, there's an idea and that's handed to one guy and then handed to another person and handed. So this is not how science evolves. It's, James Montgomery uses the idea of cross-pollination. So it's a much more diffuse development where many different influences come together. So it's not just, you know, the guy sees like something, let's say, in Cairo, and then he goes home and builds it exactly like that. So there are many, many different factors that come to bear on this, and the exchange continues across the Mediterranean in both directions. That's very, very important. So for instance, some Arabic texts that get translated into Greek, Zad al-Musafir wa Qut al-Hadir, the sustenance of the traveler and the food of the sedentary person, an encyclopedia by 9th century or early 10th century author from Tunisia, is translated into Greek, and like other texts are then translated back into Arabic, or so the exchange continues and continues beyond the Middle Ages. And so we shouldn't see this just as one thing is seen and then replicated, or one text or one idea is taken and then replicated. It's really, this idea of cross-pollination is very, very useful.
There are some a few similar questions. I hope panelists excuse me. I'm just asking as they are relevant to the previous question. One is about, is there any learning from Rome in Latin transferred to Arabic in early Islamic types? I guess the question is within the context of medicine.
Sure. So I mentioned Galen of Pergamum. He's really the most important physician writing in Greek. He spends a good part of his career in Rome. He is physician to Commodus, for instance. So I mean, Marcus Aurelius. So he's very much caught up in Roman life, and you shouldn't forget that a lot of people in Rome spoke Greek, like Caesar, for instance. You know, when he said the die is cast, alia iacta est, is the Latin. What he really said is path anerephtho kubos. You know, the die is cast in Greek. Are there Latin texts that are directly translated into from the classical Roman world that are directly translated into Arabic? The answer is no. But you have quite a few Latin loanwords that make it into Arabic. Qasr, for instance, castrum, castra, castrorum, like castle or something like that, or even sirat, street, starata via, so like the street or highway. So words come in, but they are more, they're not so much to do with medicine. It's more like military and infrastructure and things like that.
And one more question within that context. To what extent did Indian and Persian medical transition influence the Arabic?
Yes, so quite a bit. So what we find, especially in the area of materia medica, of medicinal substances, I've given you this one Indian pill. So a lot of drugs from the East come in. There are some Indian texts, that Sanskrit texts that are translated via Persian into Arabic. They're largely not extant. We only have fragments from them. The overall system of Indian medicine or Persian medicine does not leave a huge mark. But in the area of medical nomenclature, we find it. So there are diseases like Birsam and Sirsam, which comes from Barsom and Sarsom. So like an inflammation of the head, or inflammation of the pleurisy, and an inflammation of the pleuris. These enter, and we also find Middle Persian traces, so to speak, in the terminology. I can give you maybe one example or two. So Sagapenon is a drug that becomes Sagbinaj. So this ending aj at the end is the Old Middle Persian ending ag. Hiara is a holy remedy. It's basically a compound remedy that becomes Iyaraj, again, undoubtedly via Middle Persian. So we find traces of transmission. And let's not forget, even the name for hospital, Bimaristan, is Persian. So the place where sick people are. So there clearly is Persian and Indian influence, but it is not fundamental in the theoretical sense. So like the human pathology remains pretty much untouched by it. It is more in the area of recipes and, like things coming into medicinal substances coming in from the East or being named in that way.
Thank you. I think we have only 2-3 minutes left. I can only maybe ask one more question.
Okay.
There are several others, but there is one I particularly want to really ask you, which we also try to popularize several articles, how Muslim women also contributed to science. So the question is related to that. How women might have been involved in collecting and using local remedies as drugs in the Islamic world. There is a comparison with the women in the West who were often herbalists and developed many interesting cures and remedies. However, they were feared for this and often cast as witches and persecuted. So if you can please enlighten us, contribution.
Yes, so I mean, in my mind, there's no doubt that what we nowadays call body work, like so all the medical care writ large, that a lot of that was dispensed by women. But the victors write the books and take the spoils, and so women. So there's a famous history of medicine by Ibn Abi Usaymi, Uyun al-Anbar fi Tabaqat al-Attiba. And women basically, there's one exception, but it's a complicated case, basically do not feature there. So we know very little and only from indirect sources about how women contributed. So there are instances of women, for instance, being mentioned as carers in, let's say, in literature and things like that, but they're indirect and they don't feature much. I mean, women as physicians do not feature much in our sources. So we have a few little. I mean, there's a papyrus here, and there might be the word tabiba there, but there's very, very scant evidence for this, which is obviously sad, but although they probably did a lot, we don't know much about it. I mean, gynecology is a branch of medicine that is discussed in our theoretical text, and about which we know quite a bit. But so we know a bit more about women as patients, but women as practitioner, the evidence is just very, very sporadic.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Portman, for this great talk. We truly enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And the panelists, there were other questions, and I hope they can forgive us because there is no time left now. Thank you again for this inspiring talk. Hopefully, we will listen to you in another keynote speech at some point. I'm now passing over to the organizer, Jinsela. Thank you so much. I'm passing it on to you.
Hi, well, thank you guys so much for that really informative and amazing talk. It's now time to end this event, and yeah, we hope you'll enjoy it. Join us in the next event, which is Creative British Muslims. I've now put the link in the chat box as well. So thank you very much and enjoy your days.
Thanks.